A violation? What for? This is ridiculous! They can't do this!
The notice was taped to my front door like a warning from a crime scene. $10,000. That's what my HOA said I owed them for installing solar panels on my own roof. Panels that were fully permitted. Panels that reduced my electric bill. Panels you could barely see from the street. But according to them, I had violated community aesthetics. Within days, the letters turned into threats. The threats turned into daily fines. And suddenly, neighbors who once waved at me were avoiding eye contact. They thought I'd panic. They thought I'd fold. What they didn't realize was that I had already made one move they would never see coming. Before all of this started, my life in the neighborhood was quiet, predictable in the best way. I'd moved into the community 5 years earlier, drawn in by the tree-lined streets and the promise of well-maintained standards. The HOA brochures talked about harmony, shared values, and protecting property investments. At the time, it all sounded reasonable. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted a stable place to live, work from home, and slowly turn my house into something that actually felt like mine. Over the years, I followed the rules. I kept my lawn trimmed. I repainted my fence the exact shade approved by the board. When they sent out reminders about trash bins being visible from the street, mine was tucked away before sunset. I wasn't trying to stand out. If anything, I preferred blending in. But behind the neat hedges and uniform mailboxes, there was an unspoken tension in the neighborhood. The HOA board had changed leadership the year before, and with it came a different tone. The new president talked often about raising standards and protecting the image of the community. Small things started getting flagged: garden decorations, slightly different shades of exterior paint, basketball hoops left in driveways a little too long. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then my electric bills started climbing. Working from home meant my air conditioning ran almost all day in the summer. Energy prices kept creeping up, and every month the total felt like a warning sign. After running the numbers and doing weeks of research, I decided to install solar panels. It wasn't impulsive. I checked city permits. I hired a licensed contractor. I even reviewed the HOA guidelines. There were rules about visibility and placement, but nothing that outright banned solar. In fact, the state encouraged it. When the installation day came, I felt proud watching the panels go up. They sat flush against the back slope of my roof, barely visible from the street. It felt like a smart, responsible investment. Lower bills, cleaner energy. Long-term savings. For about 3 days, everything was normal. Then I noticed the curtain in my neighbor's upstairs window shift, just slightly, whenever I stepped outside. A car slowed down in front of my house more than once. A board member who had never spoken more than a polite hello suddenly stopped at the edge of my driveway, staring up at my roof without saying a word. A week later, an email from the HOA landed in my inbox with the subject line: "Immediate compliance required." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be about solar panels. It was going to be about control. The email wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It stated that my recently installed solar panels were not in compliance with the community's architectural harmony guidelines. I had 7 days to remove them or face escalating daily fines. There was no greeting. No attempt at conversation, just a deadline. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. I pulled up the HOA handbook and read through the section on exterior modifications again. It mentioned fences, paint colors, satellite dishes, even mailbox styles. Solar panels were listed, but not prohibited. The language said they must be reviewed for visual impact. Reviewed, not banned. I sent a calm, detailed response. I attached copies of my permits. I included photos showing the panels were flush with the roofline and barely visible from the street. I even highlighted a state regulation protecting homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems. I thought facts would settle it. 3 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail. The tone had changed. Now the violation was labeled major. The fine was $500 per day until compliance was achieved. And because I had not submitted an architectural review form prior to installation, I was being assessed an immediate penalty of $10,000. $10,000 for panels that were legally installed. I felt the air leave my lungs when I read it. It wasn't just the number. It was the confidence behind it. The assumption that I would panic, write a check, and tear everything down. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every interaction I'd had with the HOA board over the years. Every meeting I'd skipped because I trusted them to handle things fairly. Every rule update email I'd archived without reading too closely. The next morning, I drove past 3 houses in the neighborhood with visible satellite dishes mounted to their roofs. One of them was angled directly toward the street. Another had a backyard shed painted a slightly different shade than approved. None of them had bright orange violation stickers on their doors, but I did. 2 days later, a second notice appeared, this time physically taped to my front window. It was impossible to miss. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to read it. A couple across the street stood at the curb whispering while glancing at my house. The embarrassment was intentional. I emailed the board again, this time requesting a hearing. I asked for clarification on how my installation violated guidelines when similar exterior modifications had been approved for others. I referenced state solar access laws again. The response came quickly. My hearing would be scheduled in 3 weeks. 3 weeks of $500 per day fines. That meant another $10,500 added to the initial penalty before I could even speak in my own defense. It stopped feeling like enforcement. It started feeling like punishment. 3 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail. The tone had changed. Now the violation was labeled major. The fine was $500 per day until compliance was achieved. And because I had not submitted an architectural review form prior to installation, I was being assessed an immediate penalty of $10,000 for panels that were legally installed. I felt the air leave my lungs when I read it. It wasn't just the number. It was the confidence behind it, the assumption that I would panic, write a check, and tear everything down. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying every interaction I'd had with the HOA board over the years. Every meeting I'd skipped because I trusted them to handle things fairly. Every rule update email I'd archived without reading too closely. The next morning, I drove past 3 houses in the neighborhood with visible satellite dishes mounted to their roofs. One of them was angled directly toward the street. Another had a backyard shed painted a slightly different shade than approved. None of them had bright orange violation stickers on their doors, but I did. 2 days later, a second notice appeared, this time physically taped to my front window. It was impossible to miss. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to read it. A couple across the street stood at the curb whispering while glancing at my house. The embarrassment was intentional. I emailed the board again, this time requesting a hearing. I asked for clarification on how my installation violated guidelines when similar exterior modifications had been approved for others. I referenced state solar access laws again. The response came quickly. My hearing would be scheduled in 3 weeks. 3 weeks of $500 per day fines. That meant another $10,500 added to the initial penalty before I could even speak in my own defense. It stopped feeling like enforcement. It started feeling like punishment. As the days passed, small things began to happen. A landscaping company hired by the HOA accidentally drove across the edge of my lawn, leaving deep tire tracks. When I reported it, I was told I had no proof. A compliance inspector began parking across from my house in the evenings, sitting in his car for long stretches of time. Once, when I stepped outside, he lifted his phone and took a picture of my roof. I could feel the pressure building. Then came the community newsletter. Buried between announcements about a neighborhood potluck and pool maintenance hours was a paragraph about unauthorized exterior installations that threatened property values. It didn't name me directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew. The following weekend, I walked into the local grocery store and ran into a neighbor I'd always gotten along with. She hesitated before speaking, her smile strained. "I heard you're in some kind of dispute with the board," she said carefully. That was when I understood the strategy. This wasn't just about fines. It was about isolating me, making me look like the problem. Turning social pressure into leverage, I started documenting everything, every letter, every email, every photo of the inspector's car parked outside. I kept a dated log of interactions. I printed out copies of state statutes regarding solar protections. I even requested meeting minutes from previous architectural approvals. That request seemed to hit a nerve. Within 48 hours, I received a third letter, this one accusing me of harassment of board members for excessive communication. They warned that continued disruptive conduct could result in additional penalties. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. I was being fined for asking questions about a fine. The night before the hearing, another envelope arrived. Inside was a revised balance statement. With accumulated daily penalties, late fees, and administrative costs, the total now exceeded $18,000. And the hearing hadn't even happened yet. When the day finally came, the meeting wasn't held in a public community space. It was in a small conference room at the property management office across town. 3 board members sat at one side of a long table. The property manager sat beside them with a thick folder. They didn't look angry. They looked certain. I presented my documents calmly. I explained the legal protections. I showed photographs proving minimal visibility. I pointed out inconsistencies in enforcement. They listened in silence. Then the board president spoke about precedent and community aesthetics. He said approving my panels would open the door to visual chaos. He emphasized that rules must be followed before installation, not after. It felt less like a hearing and more like a verdict reading. By the end of the session, they upheld the fine. However, they offered a compromise. If I removed the panels within 14 days, they would reduce the total penalty to $12,000. Reduce as if they were doing me a favor. I left the building shaking, not from fear, but from a growing clarity. This was no longer about solar panels. It was about authority. Over the next week, things escalated further. A lien warning appeared in my mailbox, stating that failure to pay the assessed fines could result in legal action against my property. The word foreclosure was mentioned in small, deliberate print. I stood in my kitchen staring at that letter for a long time. The HOA had the power to place a lien on my home. They were willing to use it. Friends outside the neighborhood urged me to just pay and move on. They said it wasn't worth the stress. Fighting an HOA was like fighting City Hall, but every time I looked at my roof, I felt something shift inside me. I had done nothing wrong. The panels were legal. The fines were excessive. And the intimidation tactics were escalating. Then one evening, as I reviewed the HOA's governing documents again, I noticed something buried deep in the bylaws. A clause about renewable energy installations referenced compliance with state law and required that any denial must be reasonable and documented with specific aesthetic impact findings. Specific findings. Not general statements about harmony, not vague concerns about precedent. Specific. They had never provided that. That discovery changed everything. The next morning, I made a call I had been avoiding since the first letter arrived. And what I learned during that conversation made it clear that this fight was about to become much bigger than the HOA ever anticipated. The certified envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. By then, the total they claimed I owed had crossed $20,000. The lien paperwork was already in progress. Another warning had been posted to my account stating that failure to comply would trigger further collection remedies. The tone wasn't threatening anymore. It was confident. They believed I was cornered, but inside that envelope wasn't a check. It was a formal demand letter, drafted by an attorney who specialized in solar access law and HOA overreach. The call I had made the week before had changed everything. What I learned was simple and explosive at the same time. Under state law, HOAs could not unreasonably restrict solar installations. They also couldn't impose fines in bad faith or selectively enforce aesthetic guidelines. If they did, they exposed themselves to statutory penalties, attorney fees, and in some cases, personal liability for board members who acted outside their authority. And the way my HOA had handled this, it was a case study in overreach. The letter was precise. It outlined every timeline inconsistency. It cited the exact clause in the bylaws requiring specific aesthetic findings for denial, findings they had never produced. It referenced state statutes protecting homeowners from arbitrary solar restrictions. It demanded immediate withdrawal of all fines, removal of the lien threat, and reimbursement of my legal expenses to date. But the final paragraph was the real turning point. If they refused, the letter stated, we would file a lawsuit seeking declaratory relief, damages for bad faith enforcement, and recovery of all attorney fees. It also noted that discovery would include internal board communications regarding my property, emails, texts, and meeting notes. Discovery. That word alone changes power dynamics. Because discovery doesn't just look at what was decided, it looks at why. 3 days later, an emergency HOA board meeting was announced, not in the small management office this time, but in the community clubhouse. Residents were invited. That had never happened before. I walked into that room feeling every eye on me, some curious, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable. The board members sat at the front table, but they didn't look as certain as they had during my hearing. There was tension in their posture. Papers shuffled, voices stayed low. The property manager cleared his throat and began reading a prepared statement about clarifying architectural procedures. It sounded polished, almost rehearsed. Then the board president spoke. He explained that after further review, the board had determined my solar installation did not violate community standards. The previously assessed fines would be rescinded. The lien process would be halted immediately. A revised architectural policy would be drafted to align more clearly with state law. There was no apology, but there was something better: public reversal. A few residents exchanged glances. Someone in the back muttered that they had been thinking about installing solar too, but were afraid to try. Another neighbor asked whether other recent violations had been reviewed for consistency. The room shifted. For the first time, the board wasn't the unquestioned authority at the front of the room. They were being questioned. But the moment that truly changed everything came when my attorney, who had quietly attended the meeting, stood and asked a single question: whether the board intended to reimburse the homeowner for costs incurred due to improper enforcement. Silence filled the space, because rescinding fines is one thing, admitting fault is another. After a brief private consultation at the front table, the board announced that they would consider reimbursement pending review. It wasn't immediate victory, but it was clear. The power they had tried to use against me had forced them into a public retreat, and as I walked out of that clubhouse, neighbors who had avoided eye contact weeks earlier stopped me to ask questions, to shake my hand, to say they hadn't realized the rules could be pushed back on. The HOA thought a $10,000 fine would make an example out of me. They didn't expect that fighting back would make an example out of them. When I walked out of that clubhouse meeting, the air felt different, not lighter, not celebratory, just honest. For weeks, I had felt like I was standing alone in the middle of a quiet, carefully landscaped battlefield. Now, for the first time, it was clear that other people had been watching, and more importantly, thinking. Within a week of the public reversal, the HOA sent a formal letter confirming that all fines had been rescinded. The balance on my account was zero. The lien paperwork had been officially withdrawn. They described it as a procedural clarification, but something else arrived shortly after. A second letter, this one far more cautious in tone, stating that the board would reimburse my documented legal expenses in the interest of community harmony. Community harmony. The same phrase they had used to justify threatening my home. The reimbursement wasn't framed as an apology. There was no admission of wrongdoing, but money has a way of saying what words won't. They knew they had pushed too far. They knew discovery would have forced their internal communications into daylight, and they knew the optics of dragging a homeowner into court over legally protected solar panels would not end well. The panels stayed on my roof. But that wasn't the real outcome. Over the next month, something unexpected began happening in the neighborhood. Residents started attending board meetings, not one or two, dozens. People who had never shown up before began asking questions about enforcement policies, about architectural approvals, about how fines were calculated and how many had been issued in the past year. Someone requested a transparency report on violation notices. Another asked why some exterior modifications seemed to pass without scrutiny, while others triggered immediate penalties. The board's answers were no longer delivered with quiet certainty. They were measured, careful, defensive.
Looks great. You did it.
The newsletter's a nice touch.
Thanks. It was a team effort. Beautiful day, isn't it? It really is. So peaceful.
And look, the panels are working.
Perfect.
Then the newsletter changed. Instead of warnings about compliance, it included a new section titled Homeowner Rights and Responsibilities. It referenced state protections for renewable energy installations. It clarified that no architectural denial could be issued without documented specific reasoning. That clause, the one buried in the bylaws that had almost gone unnoticed, was now front and center. 2 months later, a neighbor 3 houses down installed solar panels of his own. This time the review process was quick, professional, approved without resistance, no orange notice on his door, no daily fines, no threats. And when I saw the installers on his roof, I felt something close to pride, not because I had won an argument, but because the rules were finally being applied the way they should have been from the beginning. But the long-term consequences didn't stop there. During the next HOA election cycle, 3 board seats opened. For the first time in years, those seats were contested. Candidates ran on platforms of transparency, fairness, and reducing punitive enforcement tactics. They referenced recent events without naming them directly. They promised clearer guidelines and better communication. 2 of the previous board members did not run again. 1 lost. The new board's first action wasn't dramatic. It wasn't revolutionary. It was procedural. They commissioned an independent review of the HOA's enforcement history and updated the architectural guidelines to remove vague language like visual harmony and replace it with measurable, objective standards. Ambiguity had been the weapon. Clarity became the reform. I won't pretend everything transformed overnight. HOAs are still HOAs. Rules still exist. There are still disagreements about paint colors and fence heights and landscaping choices, but something fundamental shifted. Fear left the room. The unspoken assumption that the board's word was final, unchallengeable, was gone. Residents realized that governance doesn't mean control without accountability. It means responsibility. As for me, life returned to something resembling normal. My electric bills dropped significantly. Each month, when I saw the lower total, it felt like quiet confirmation that the decision to install solar had been right, not just financially, but symbolically. There's something powerful about generating your own energy, about not relying entirely on systems that can be manipulated or weaponized. And in a strange way, that's what this entire dispute had been about: control. The HOA tried to assert it. I refused to surrender it. One afternoon, months after the dispute ended,